Today we're going to be speaking with Kathryn Judge, who's the Harvey J. Goldschmidt Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and also author of the book Direct: The Rise of the Middleman Economy and the Power of Going to the Source. Really great having you on. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I think intuitively many in our audience will understand the concept of middlemen in the global economy. And my instinct is that at some point it was quite logical to start seeing middlemen as we started to see many industries scale, international trade. You know, we could think of reasons why it made sense. What are the origins of so many middlemen in so many of the industries with which we regularly engage?
I mean, you really hit on a lot of the drivers. So the middlemen are the connectors through whom goods flow, through money flows from people who have it to those who need it. And both as the economy got more global, but also as it got more specialized, we saw proliferation of middlemen helping to facilitate those transfers. So you might have, investors with excess capital in one country and limited opportunities for return. And so you ended up initially with one, and then subsequently, oftentimes, layers of middlemen that would help facilitate flows to where there might be productive undertakings, even if that meant kind of moving the money abroad. Similarly, in production, we know gains from trade is a classic idea. And of course, we've had a shift from just having goods imported from one country to another to really having globalized supply chains where goods are made in a multi-continent undertaking, with each step kind of undertaking what it can do most efficiently. But of course, as you have that disaggregation of production, you need middlemen to help connect each step along the way.
So before we talk about some of the downsides, I mean, it seems accurate to say that in many cases, consumers do see lower prices on many products as a result of middlemen. Is that fair?
That's certainly fair. I mean, one of the points of the book is actually middlemen usually arise because they're really providing significant value. And it explores how overcoming the informational and logistical challenges that can otherwise impede transactions that make everybody better off is a real value enhancing service to provide. So middlemen themselves are at this point really the backbone of the economy. They're not going to go anywhere soon. But what the book explores is that in a static environment, you can take a snapshot, and it looks like they're providing a lot of value, and oftentimes they are. But the very nature of what makes them so good at their jobs also gives them the ability to exercise outsized influence on the evolution of the market and the evolution of the laws that are governing the spaces where they're active, that sometimes allows them to extract more value and lead to potentially other challenges in future periods. So really,
So, and when you say that, because if I think of like Walmart and Amazon are middlemen in a sense, in that they don't manufacture most of the products they sell. So in a sense, they've created this marketplace very convenient for all sorts of different products. But they also will contract with other middlemen in many cases as well. So they both are middlemen and also are not, depending on which relationship we're thinking of.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting points is when you look, the term middleman itself is it's easy to define in the abstract, but when you're trying to apply that to particular companies, part of what you realize is a lot of middlemen do provide additional value along the way. So their primary role might be helping to overcome informational or logistical challenges, but oftentimes they're doing other things in the process, right? And so the goal is to say, look, it's not going to ever be a clean line, but conceptually, it's helpful to understand companies that are primarily engaged in this business of connecting, and Amazon and Walmart are among them. They certainly have other activities that they engage in. Amazon, with something like Amazon Web Services, is providing a completely different type of value proposition. But much of what they do is make it so American consumers can very readily access and have enough information to trust to buy goods that were made on the other side of the world. So there's efficiencies there, and there's a real connection that's provided, but there's drawbacks.
One of the things that I think is a concern for many in my audience from the things we've talked about is the ways in which sometimes very large corporations will use middlemen and or contractors to avoid accountability in some cases, sometimes point the finger at some other entity. You know, the Amazon delivery services is one where often the vans that we all see driving around are not actually owned and operated by Amazon, even if they have Amazon painted. Sometimes it's local LLC delivery companies that own a bunch of vans, or, there's different things. Is this one of the concerns with this infrastructure where you have all of these different parties?
It is one of the very significant concerns. So part of the challenge is, if you're just going directly to the creator of a good, not only there's a relationship there, but there's clear accountability. And any information you want about that good, you can readily ascertain by asking the person or asking for representations and warranties, if you want to be legalistic, about the product, but also about the nature of how it was made and who was impacted. And part of what the book shows is that much of the complexity of today's supply chains and the structure of these layers of intermediaries grew up at a time where we just assume investors wanted to maximize the risk adjusted returns and consumers wanted nothing more than the lowest price good, holding quality constant according to some objective measures. But now we're in a world where people suddenly realize the government can't solve all of our problems. We actually care more about the impact of the goods on the planet, on the workers, and both through intentional use of middlemen to obfuscate, but also just a byproduct of really complex chains that were not necessarily designed to create opacity, but as a practical matter have created that opacity. It is now virtually impossible at times to understand. I mean, you can look at your breakfast cereal and trying to figure out where it all came from is oftentimes beyond the average consumer's capability. And so as we're bringing these additional values to the table, the accountability that people now want is oftentimes very difficult, if not impossible, to glob on top of the current system.
Yeah, I mean, in the kind of like hipster lefty space that I occupy, there's been a big move in the last 5 years to go towards, craft and independent producers and products that are not as widely available. Sometimes that in and of itself is what makes them more interesting. And I do think that there is value to that because, if you think about like the coffee roasting industry, instead of going to your grocery store and grabbing the, Allegro that's available nationally or whatever, you find some local roaster and it's more interesting and you know who's roasting it. But it's almost always more expensive. And so it does seem that there is a very clear advantage, at least in the minds of consumers, to that. But there is certainly a price associated with it.
Yeah, and so I want to say a couple of things on that. So first, I love the coffee roasting example. One of the examples in my books is Roost Roasters, which was a local coffee roaster, and I knew them when they were small and they kept growing, but it is really nice. And one of the nice things about going direct is even though it's more expensive, you not only learn a lot, but you know where the money's going. So I actually feel a little better about the money I'm spending because I know the company, I know it's a local business, I know all of the people involved, I know how they treat their employees. So I actually feel better about the money I spent. And that is partly shifting from a world where we had long assumed scarcity to one where, as a practical matter, even though we still have a scarcity mindset because that's how we're taught to think so often, we really live in a world of abundance. So making more selective choices is oftentimes more rewarding, which is part of why you're seeing the trends you are. The final point I would make is even though that's very often true, that right now direct is a little bit of a privileged good or seems like a privileged good.
Yep.
It's more pervasive than people realize outside of cities. So I get this question all the time from people who live in relatively urban environments. I live in an urban environment. But right now I'm out in our country. And part of what's been interesting since I published the book is I'm hearing from people in South Carolina and Ohio, all of these different states where they say this is exactly what's already happening in my community. And actually they're keeping all of the value in their community and they're not necessarily paying as much as a premium because it's not the craft artisan that we think about in Brooklyn or kind of like a fun neighborhood as much as somebody who's really just like trying to make additional money by doing a product or a service on the side and maintains competitive by having good prices. It's not going to be as cheap as the mass-produced good in Walmart, partly because there you're exploiting kind of these incredibly low wage and worker protections in other places, but you really can, I think, hit a broader set of the value spectrum that many of us appreciate.
When it comes to supply chain and some of the issues that we saw early in the pandemic and then sort of again, and then even now to some degree, and we've seen baby formula and different things, it's not completely obvious to me as someone who does not share your level of expertise in this issue, whether the problem was made worse or was actually resolved more quickly by the kind of status quo of many middlemen in terms of supply chains and the way that products kind of get to the shelves and ultimately into people's homes. What is the relationship or the connection between those supply chain issues we've seen over the last 3 years and the existence of middlemen?
So I would say in terms of the risk, what we've seen arise, it really can be traced back to the proliferation of middlemen.
Hmm.
But even though middlemen have, as you point out, I think accurately played a role in helping us to address the challenges, part of what the direct documents is the way middlemen proliferated slowly in number to become more layered in ways that really created these complex ecosystems. And generally speaking, nobody took a step back to look at the entire complex ecosystem. They were thinking we can eke a little more cost savings here, a little more efficiency there. And so they kept making decisions that incrementally were small, but in aggregate transformed the nature of the system. And then as we saw, once there were shifts, whether it's these spike in demand or limitations of supply because countries of origins, were facing shutdowns, there were ripple effects that magnified that original distortion because you had all of these suddenly individual players that had depended on the system working well, having to figure out how to signal, what they wanted, what they needed in ways where they were really looking out for themselves. And so you suddenly ended up with people wanting, like demanding for more than they actually needed because they were trying to hoard. And really the distortions kept getting bigger. And what's interesting for me is that this was actually one of the original motivations for the book. A lot of my original work was on financial regulation and looking at the way securitization chains that proliferated in the early aughts contributed to the '07 and '08 crisis. And we saw the exact same thing there, where we saw these chains that grew. So they were capital supply chains as opposed to good supply chains, but they grew incrementally over time. They appeared to make credit more available. So more people could buy homes. And that seemed like a really good thing at the time because we could suddenly tap in to these new pools of capital in Germany and Japan to fund American homes. But we created an incredibly complex ecosystem where once things broke down a little, the dysfunction magnified and nobody had the information they needed to help stabilize the functioning.
Yeah, it seems there's this interesting example I remember from early in the pandemic related to toilet paper, where, as you say, people started, wasn't that people were using more in total, but they were buying more, meaning they would be stocked up for a longer period of time. And it was shifting from being at work to being at home. And one of the questions a lot of people were asking was, well, all of the companies that deliver paper goods to businesses, shouldn't they just be able to redirect that and put it in grocery stores or at CVS or whatever the case may be? And part of the explanation was, well, we're talking about different packaging. These things are not packaged for sale in the same way. And that's done much earlier in the supply chain, often before it gets to the middlemen, the local company that you go to. Also, sometimes like the toilet paper rolls for businesses are gigantic, and it just doesn't work at home. But also the companies doing the servicing office buildings don't have any connection whatsoever to like CVS or Staples or whatever. So there were really a whole bunch of things that would have had to change. Now, would it have been simpler if the toilet paper manufacturers dealt directly with everyone? I don't know. That would have had its own share of problems.
Yeah, and part of the book is really not saying direct is the solution as much as direct is the cornerstone. And a cornerstone really is a very, very small piece of a much larger edifice. So the point is saying we've gotten to this hyper intermediated world where, generally speaking, the instinct was always to add additional layers of middlemen. But as you nicely pointed out earlier, there's already a counter movement underway. There's already a number of people saying, to be able to really get what I want, to have my values match my actions, I need to opt out of the system entirely. And so by documenting both the growth of this hyper intermediated world and this revolution, well, then we can figure out how to navigate this territory in between. And the toilet paper is a great example of it. So as you're pointing out, the nature of the supply chains had incredible rigidities, which just meant like they were used to doing one things and they couldn't easily change.
Right.
And oftentimes what we're seeing with those rigidities, the complexity really accentuates them. And it's not about going direct, but having fewer middlemen and shorter chains can oftentimes enhance resilience and enhance flexibility. So it's trying to figure out where did we add layers over time without anybody really understanding, well, what are the states of the world where things might go wrong and where that might create problems, or going back to our earlier conversation, where there might be a lack of accountability because now there's just no way for us to actually see through all of the different layers involved.
There are some industries where there's been a move into a more direct model. One of the ones I think is interesting is, for me, the experience of going to car dealers has never been good. I mean, it's not a pleasant experience, very low satisfaction with it for the average consumer. I ordered my last car online. It's a Tesla. I didn't have to talk to anybody. I picked the features I wanted. There was no negotiation. And then I got a call when the car was ready. And it was a dramatically better experience. Now, this is all aside from all the other concerns about Elon Musk's tweets, all these different things. I get that. But as an experience, the dealership is a terrible experience. And it seems to me that it would only make the end product more expensive. One report says, on average, people pay about $1,200 more for vehicles than they otherwise would because of the dealership experience. Another one that, as many real estate agents that I have in my social circle, that I think could be eliminated is the idea that a realtor regularly takes, a slice out of every real estate transaction, can sell the same house multiple times. In many countries, you just deal with a lawyer and you don't need the entire infrastructure of the real estate agent. You could potentially cut out a middleman. Can you talk about either of those industries and or other industries that have done well at moving to a more direct model?
So both absolutely outstanding examples. I spent a lot of time on residential real estate, and the car market fits equally well. And I'd actually done a huge amount of research and only left it out because I had so many other great examples.
Yeah.
So the great thing about your Tesla example is, yes, it was a better experience. And contrary to our earlier conversation, it was cheaper. You're cutting out an expensive middleman and you're saving real money. And same thing in residential real estate. We know for your average middle class family, the median family in the United States, they don't have most of their money in stocks and bonds. Housing is our number one source of wealth. So when real estate agents come in and take 5% on average, even now, of every single real estate transaction, you are eating directly out of the bottom line, the nest egg of your typical middle class family in a very meaningful way.
Now,
So
many
yes,
of the real estate agents in their defense are also middle class, right? I mean, there's two sides to that, to be fair.
Yeah, the hard thing with a real estate agent is there's some really good research just showing that we have too many of them. So they provide very real value, but it's relatively easy to become a real estate agent. So what we've seen is there's some great work showing, comparing, for example, Minneapolis and Boston and saying, look, when housing prices were about the same, each agent sold on average like 10 houses a year or 12 houses a year. And then suddenly the Boston housing market went crazy. So a decade later, what happened? Real estate agents in Minneapolis were still selling 10 to 12 houses a year. Real estate agents in Boston, their income was about the same, but they were suddenly selling on average 4 to 5 houses a year. And that's because the commissions went up because they were a percentage of sales. So many more people became real estate agents. And then so what do they all do? They send out like really glossy mailings to people who already own their homes, just saying like, choose me if you're going to sell. So it's not actually against the real estate agents themselves. It's a system that doesn't serve the agents and really doesn't serve homeowners.
Right.
And one nice thing about both the car market and the real estate market is they are examples where there have been state laws across numerous states that entrench the current system. So for example, if you look at penetration of electric vehicle sales, one of the most significant indicators is, do you have state laws that effectively entrench the need to use a car dealership?
Doesn't New Jersey have such a law?
Yeah, and I think so. I should double check, but a number of states do, and 10 states still have things protecting effectively prohibiting rebates. Because really, for real estate, it's the buy side more than the sell side, where a lot of countries have managed to get rid of the agent. So oftentimes sellers need a little more handholding, but you're also paying a lot to a buyer where they're doing their own work on Zillow or Redfin. But of course, what you're really tapping into there is the MLS, which is still controlled by full service real estate agents. And so those are both great examples where when you really look at the mechanisms, they're layered and a little complicated, but where you see people who came in originally and provided value, and then in a post-internet era, where there's so much more ability for consumers to do things for themselves, we should have had a change in the market structure, but the change has been relatively modest, relative to the cost savings and the alternatives that open up. And it's partly because the entrenched middlemen really do a good job to undermine the alternatives that otherwise would be available, both through market mechanisms and through legal mechanisms.
Yeah, justifying their own existence, essentially. The book is Direct: The Rise of the Middleman Economy and the Power of Going to the Source. We've been speaking with the book's author, Kathryn Judge, who teaches law at Columbia Law School. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.